Dry Mesa, New Mexico, winter of 1892. The snow had come early, quiet, thin, like breath held too long. Most folks walked faster in that kind of cold. But Virgil Wade didn't. He followed the wind behind the butcher's shop. Not because he meant to help, just because something in it sounded wrong. And there they were, 5 children huddled near a bone pile. One held a feed sack like a blanket. Another looked up, not begging, just asking, "Do you have any leftovers?" He could have walked away. No one would have blamed him. But some silences don't deserve to be answered with more silence. And that day, a man with nothing left to offer gave what he could. What follows ain't a tale of outlaws or revenge. It's about what stays when the world turns cold and someone finally chooses not to. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, thin and steady, like something trying not to be heard. Snow drifted slowly through Dry Mesa, too early for a storm, but early enough to make folks look toward their woodpiles and mutter about the kind of winter it might be. Virgil Wade didn't say much anymore. He hadn't for years, not since Evelyn passed and the cattle thinned and the fence line bowed from more wind than wire. At 59, he carried himself like a man older than his bones but younger than his silence. His mornings belonged to the saloon only because the coffee there stayed hot longer than his hearth did. That afternoon, he sat where he always sat, at the second table near the stove, back to the wall, boots spread for warmth. His cup had gone cold again. He didn't notice. His eyes weren't on the cup, nor on the cards clicking over at the table near the window. He was just letting time move past him, same as always, same as most. The door slammed open hard enough to flap the calendar behind the bar. Wind rolled in, along with a man in a wool coat too thin for the weather. Dust and frost hung in his beard like frost on barbed wire. Behind the butcher's, the man said low, "Ain't no dog back there." Virgil looked up. No one else did. The man turned and left, like he'd only come in to drop off a warning, or maybe a confession. Either way, his boots left snow behind, little crescent marks already melting on the worn floorboards. Something in Virgil's spine straightened. He stood. He didn't say a word, didn't ask a question, just pulled on his coat, heavy with old trail dust, and walked out into the wind that was no longer just wind. The alley behind Winslow's butcher shop wasn't a place anyone meant to go. It stank of old fat, of meat too long in the sun, of bone piles left for dogs or coyotes, the kind of place a town like Dry Mesa let rot quietly, the same way it forgot widows or drunks or families who'd wandered in too far west. Virgil rounded the corner and saw them, 5 children, huddled low behind the stacked crates, half hidden by a crooked fence and a row of blood-rusted barrels. Their coats didn't match. One wore a man's shirt, pinned tight at the sleeves. Another had feed sack fabric stitched into the knees of her pants. None of them spoke, except the woman. She crouched close, clutching a bundled baby to her chest. The child's eyes were closed, mouth open in that restless sleep babies fall into when warmth is scarce and hunger keeps coming back. Her own face was hollow, skin drawn thin over high cheeks and darker around the eyes like bruises made of weariness. She looked up but didn't flinch. And that's what caught him, not her desperation, but the way she didn't bother to hide it. Like she'd already used up her fear, like the wind had worn it off her, just like it wore the color off old fence posts. The oldest girl, 12 maybe, lifted her head. Her voice was thin, but even. "Mister," she said, "do you got anything left?" Virgil didn't answer. Not right away. There was no one else in the alley, no one watching, and still it felt like a moment too big to hold in his chest. He reached into his coat, From the inside pocket, he drew out a waxed cloth bundle he hadn't touched since morning. Inside, half a strip of deer jerky, 2 biscuits from last night, gone hard around the edges. He handed it over. The girl didn't lunge. She didn't even take it. The woman did. Slow, deliberate. She nodded once. That was all. The boy nearest the barrels was shaking, not from fear, from cold. Virgil glanced at the shed 20 feet away, the old stall behind the livery where he kept nothing anymore except dust, rusted tools, and a bent shovel he'd meant to throw out last spring. "You'll find cover there," he said, voice gravelly with disuse. He didn't offer more, didn't offer less. He turned back the way he came, snow whispering against his boots, and left the wind to settle behind him. That night the saloon was quieter than usual. Word hadn't traveled yet, but it would. Dry Mesa had a way of finding out what folks did in silence and deciding what it meant for them. Virgil sat in his chair again, back to the wall, coffee warm this time. He looked through the frost-laced window. It faced the alley, and though he couldn't see the shed, he saw the way the snow fell heavier now, the kind that stuck, the kind that stayed. He sipped once, then set the cup down. His hand hovered near the rim a moment longer, then pulled away. Outside, a small candle flickered behind the cracked wood slats of the shed. Inside, a man who had nothing left to say was thinking of the way those children didn't ask for anything loud, just leftovers and a little space out of the wind. The sun rose slowly over Dry Mesa, dim behind a quilt of clouds that looked like they'd never move again. Snow had crusted during the night, not the soft kind, but hard-packed, jagged where wind had dragged it into ridges along the alley and the backs of buildings. From his porch, Virgil Wade could see the shed roof slumped under a thin white layer. He didn't move for a while. He just stood there, coffee cup in one hand, staring past the fence lines, past the butcher's shop, toward the place where the shape of silence had shifted. It wasn't pity that stirred in him. It was recognition. He remembered what it was to be turned from a barn door. Evelyn still had breath in her then. Their mule had gone lame, and the baby she'd been carrying had stopped kicking 2 days before they crossed the canyon. He'd asked only for a night's warmth. They'd slammed the door. Said the sheriff was watching vagrants too close lately. Said there was no more room. He buried the memory with every fence post he set over the next 20 years. But some ghosts don't stay buried when snow comes back. By the time he reached the shed, a thin smoke line curled from a pipe he hadn't used in years. He stopped just outside the door. Didn't knock. Just waited. The door creaked open. She stood there, Annie Mae. At least that's what the talk would call her soon. Virgil didn't know it yet, didn't ask. Her eyes were sharper in daylight, though dull from wear. There was no fear in them, just the kind of exhaustion that made everything feel like stone. He held out a bundle, a folded sheet of canvas, an old kettle, and a chipped tin ladle. Behind her, one child peeked out. A boy with one sock and no shoes. His lip was cracked from the cold, but he clutched a smaller girl like a soldier on guard. Virgil didn't speak. She didn't thank, but she took the bundle. That was the start of it. Later that day, Virgil sat again in the saloon, didn't touch his coffee, just let the warmth of the stove creep up his boots. Conversations turned as they always did when something unspoken passed through town. "That's Annie Mae," someone said near the stove, voice wrapped in spit and tobacco. "Ran off with a card sharp 2 years ago. Thought she was better than us. Now look at her. 5 brats and not a ring in sight." Laughter came dry and brittle. Not enough to fill the room, but enough to cut into it. Virgil didn't turn, didn't lift his eyes, but his hand did tighten on the rim of the cup. He remembered the cold shoulder of a preacher once, back when he and Evelyn had begged for a second blanket. He remembered how silence had felt heavier than hunger that winter. He'd learned that words didn't fix things. but actions. That's where men showed what they meant. That evening the wind picked up again, sharper than before. He went back out with a bundle of dry straw from the barn and a pail of water hauled from the well. Didn't knock, just leaned the bucket near the stall and laid the straw where the wind wouldn't steal it. When he turned to leave, the door opened. The girl, Clara, stood there. 12, maybe younger. Hard to tell beneath the coat, 2 sizes too big. Her eyes were the same as the night before, only clearer now. Still quiet, still cautious, but clearer. "Thank you," she said. Not loud, not forced. Virgil paused, then tipped his hat. Didn't say a word. In the morning, hoofprints by the shed told him they'd come out early. Maybe the older ones had tried to find firewood. Maybe not. He left 4 small logs by the stall door. One had initials carved on it from long ago, E.W. He didn't mean to leave that one, but once it was down, he didn't take it back. Midweek, the town's tone shifted. A woman at the dry goods store asked, "You seen what that old Wade is doing?" Bringing them feed sacks like their family. The undertone wasn't kind, but Virgil didn't live for town whispers. He lived for the moment he passed by the alley that morning and saw a small girl, maybe 6, drawing with a piece of charcoal on the shed wall. Just circles, just movement. Her tongue stuck out in the way children do when they forget the world is watching. He didn't say anything, just left behind half a loaf of cornbread and the heel of a cheese block from the root cellar. Later that night, he heard the soft sound of children laughing, real belly-deep laughter, echo from the stall across the snow-covered lot. And for the first time in longer than he could place, he smiled, not big, not wide, but enough to feel the skin near his eyes crinkle again. The next morning, before Dawn had finished waking, someone knocked on his cabin door. Not loud, just enough to announce their presence. He opened it to see Clara. She didn't shiver, though her sleeves were wet. She held out a spoon. Bent, dulled from use. "We made stew," she said. You can have some." Behind her, Annie Mae stood by the edge of the fence. She didn't approach, didn't look away. Virgil took the spoon, didn't ask what was in it, didn't need to. He dipped it once, nodded, and said only, "Tastes like it ought to." That night, he put a second coffee cup on the table. Didn't pour it yet. Just left it there, facing the seat across from him, like it had never left. The wind in dry mesa changed around midweek, not stronger, just meaner. It dragged across the wooden buildings with a dry rasp, carrying dust even through snow. Folks pulled collars higher, not just against the cold, but against the talk that always came when something didn't fit neat into their world. And 5 children in a rancher's stall, well, that didn't fit. Virgil Wade stepped out early that morning, tugging his coat closed. Steam rising from the coffee he cradled. He'd poured 2 cups again, one for himself, one that just sat there, cooling beside an empty chair. The second cup wasn't for the dead. It wasn't for the living either, not yet. It was for the space that hadn't quite become a person again, but maybe could. By the time he passed the smithy, the talk had bloomed like burrweed. "She waltzes back in here after years, like dry mesa forgot," grunted Joe Riggins, hammering down on a horseshoe. "She didn't come waltzing," said the cooper, but he didn't speak loud enough to matter. Riggins wiped his brow. "Ran off with some 2-bit gambler. Left town in that red dress, remember? Now she's back with a sack full of mouths. And no husband in sight." A younger boy sweeping coal dust from the corner asked, "She got a name?" "Annie Mae, or maybe just Annie. Don't matter now, she's not who she used to be." The words settled into Virgil's coat like burrs. He didn't pause, just walked past, but they stayed with him. Later, down by the shed, he found a sock frozen to the edge of the trough and 2 small hands digging under a crust of snow. for leftover oats. Trying to get enough to feed the baby goat, someone must have snuck in under a blanket. The girl, Clara, again froze when she saw him. She didn't speak, didn't run either, just stayed kneeling, one hand shielding her little brother from the cold wind. Virgil bent, picked up the sock, and tucked it beneath a wrapped bundle he'd brought. Wood shavings, dry kindling, and a blanket so old it still smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk it had come out of. He didn't say anything. She didn't either, but her shoulders dropped just a little, as if, for once, she didn't have to keep them raised like armor. At the mercantile, the clerk eyed him as he bought 2 extra tins of beans and sewing needles. "For the lady, I assume?" she asked, tone clipped and sharp, like she was daring him to confirm. Virgil didn't answer, just laid the coins down and left. Out front, he passed a group of women pretending not to look at him. They fell quiet, except for one who muttered too loud to be accidental. Helping's one thing, harboring's another. That night, back in the stall, the children had made something out of nothing. A line of twine held up a patchwork curtain made from feed sackcloth, dividing the stall into what looked like separate sleeping spots. 2 wooden crates had been turned into makeshift chairs. Someone had drawn stars on the wall using soot and their thumb. Jonas, the quiet boy, sat carving with a butter knife into a flat board. A lopsided horse took shape. Annie Mae looked up when Virgil stepped into the doorway. Her face wasn't afraid, just tired, but the way she held her chin, he could tell the talk had reached her too. "I know what they're saying," she said quietly, "and I don't expect you to keep showing up." Virgil looked at the children, then at her. "I didn't ask them," he said. "Ain't gonna start now." She nodded once, slow, like someone who'd been preparing to be turned away again, but didn't quite know what to do with the opposite. Later that week, he overheard a new thread to the gossip. "Folks say he lost his mind," said an old man playing checkers outside the barber shop. "Letting strays live in his shed, giving out food like he's building a family again." His companion chuckled. "Maybe that's what it is, trying to replace the wife and boy he buried." That one landed like a punch. Virgil walked past without blinking, but something inside him recoiled. Not at the words, at the memory. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. It had been 19 years since Evelyn passed. They'd only had one boy, born blue and silent. He hadn't lived long enough for a name. Evelyn never came back from that grief, not truly. Her laughter dried up like a summer creek. She took to the porch, rocking, staring out at the road like it owed her something it had never promised. Virgil had built the fence taller that spring, not to keep anything out, but to keep the silence in. And now, just when that silence had begun to shift, when children's feet thumped soft against barn floors and someone sang lullabies and half melodies at dusk, the world wanted to shove it all back down. That night, he found a small sock mended with crooked stitches left on his porch rail. Folded inside was a pebble with a heart scratched into it. No name. Just a gesture. He didn't smile, not yet. But he brought the second coffee cup closer to the fire, and for the first time, poured it full. Didn't touch it, didn't drink it, just let it sit there, alive with heat, waiting. Mia. It was the kind of morning where the cold didn't just bite. It settled into joints, into lumber, into the very grain of the world. The sun had come up reluctantly, casting pale yellow light that barely warmed the edge of the valley. Most of Dry Mesa stayed indoors when the air cut that sharp. But Virgil Wade moved through it like the cold had long ago stopped bothering him. Maybe it had. Maybe grief was colder. He had no real plan that morning, just a bundle in his arms and the kind of instinct that doesn't require much thinking. Some men brought flowers to graves. Virgil brought canvas and a tin pail of water to an old horse stall. The children were awake when he arrived. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He just opened the stall door quiet as breath and stepped inside like it was the most natural thing in the world to be bringing supplies to strangers huddled beside dry straw. The girl Clara stirred first, same stiff shoulders, same calm, unreadable eyes. No fear, just waiting. The baby was bundled tight in what looked like 2 feed sacks stitched together, lying beside a kindling fire that had already started to die. Virgil set the canvas roll against the wall, unwrapped the edges, and laid out a section like flooring, dry and thick. The rest he hung over a split rafter to block wind. He didn't say what it was for. Annie Mae stood to the side, arms wrapped around herself. Not in shame, not in pride, but something in between. Like she'd forgotten how to let herself just be seen. Her hands twitched once, almost as if to protest, then quieted. Virgil handed her the tin pail. She took it without a word. Out front of the saloon that day, someone asked Virgil if he'd lost his mind. "Ain't your place to rescue nobody." The man muttered, leaning against a whiskey barrel. "Let God sort the strays." Virgil didn't respond. He never did when fools used scripture to excuse cruelty. Instead, he walked back to the blacksmith and bartered a cracked axe head for a bundle of old nails. On the way home, he stopped by the dry creek and cut some willow branches, strong but bendable. His arms were full by the time he turned onto the lane toward his ranch. The wind picked up dust again, but this time it seemed to blow with him, not against. Inside the stall, something had shifted. Jonas, the quiet boy, had arranged stones in a circle like a little fire pit. Clara had made a shelf out of an old fruit crate, placing their few items on it like treasures: a button, a small spoon, a bent horseshoe. Annie had tacked up one of the blankets to form a corner space, private but not hidden. It was no home. But it was no longer just shelter either. It was, something beginning. Virgil noticed how she stood taller now. Not much, but enough. How she didn't flinch when he stepped inside. How she let the baby rest on the canvas without checking it for splinters. "Fixin' to build a better wall for that side," he muttered. She nodded. "Wind breaks more than cold." Her voice was scratchy from disuse, or maybe from the habit of holding too much in. Still, it filled the stall like a dry song, not quite a melody, but close. That night he returned to the porch with cold fingers and a tightness in his chest he hadn't had in years. Not illness, not guilt, but something like remembering. He stared at the extra cup of coffee growing cold beside him, the one he always poured out of stubborn ritual. Then he picked it up, stood, and walked toward the barn. He didn't know if she'd drink it, but he left it just inside the stall door, still warm, still full. When he came back an hour later, the cup was empty and rinsed. The following morning he found something new. A strip of fabric, a child's attempt at a curtain, fluttering at the stall opening, tied with twine. Inside, the children had rearranged again. The goat had a corner of its own. A broom made of bundled grass leaned against the wall. Clara mended a shirt with slow, careful stitches. Her hands worked with the kind of patience that came from doing things without expectation of praise. Jonas fed twigs into a little fire pit. And Annie, she was braiding her hair. For the first time. Not for anyone else, just because. Virgil stood outside longer than usual that day, watching. He didn't know what this was yet. Not a family, not charity, not obligation. But something in his chest gave way just a little when he heard the soft hum of a tune, half sung, half remembered, rising from that stall like smoke. It wasn't joy. Not yet, but it wasn't nothing. Mia Sunday morning brought stillness to Dry Mesa, the kind that settles heavy over fence posts and rooftops. like dust too tired to drift. The church bell rang once, then again, thin and cracked. Most folks were already halfway into their pews by the time Virgil Wade stepped outside, boots dragging a bit from sleep not quite earned. He didn't go to church, hadn't in years, not since the pine box lowered in silence and no hymns had been sung. His worship was different now, measured in firewood chopped straight, fences mended before winter, and quiet acts that never made it into anyone's prayer circle. This morning, though, the sound that stopped him wasn't a bell. It was laughter, faint, quick, then again. Not the loud kind, not the belly-deep kind that boys threw at each other across streets. This was something smaller, something careful. He turned slowly, letting the sound guide him like scent on a breeze. His boots carried him toward the shed, not in a hurry, not lingering, just letting the moment stretch on the way it wanted to. The stall door was cracked open. Sunlight caught in the dust motes hanging there, like gold threads stitched into air. Inside, the girl Clara sat on a crate, needle in hand. She was focused, head bent, pulling thread through a wool sock so thin it seemed almost transparent. Her fingers were clumsy but determined. Beside her, Annie crouched with her youngest daughter in her lap, a small child with hair like crushed pecan shells and cheeks still pink from the cold. Annie held a broken comb in one hand. The teeth were snapped, but she was using it anyway. Slow strokes down her daughter's tangled hair. And then it came again, the laughter, soft as down. The little girl giggled, hiding her face in the curve of her mother's neck. And Annie, she smiled. Just a twitch at first, then a fuller curl of the mouth, like muscle memory slowly waking. Virgil stepped back before they saw him. He didn't want to be the thing that made it stop. That evening, as the wind came down from the north, hard and mean, Virgil brought a box with him to the stall. He didn't say a word, just left it on the step and turned back toward the house. Inside the box was a pair of children's boots, worn but clean, small. Probably belonged to his nephew's boy once before they moved east and sent back a trunk of outgrown things nobody wanted. He figured they'd fit the quiet boy, Jonas. And if they didn't, someone would grow into them. He didn't expect thanks. He didn't want it. But later that night, when he stepped outside to pour out the coffee that always cooled in its second cup, he saw them again. The boots, lined up neatly beside the door, not left behind, not rejected, just acknowledged, and beside them a single white stone had been placed. Round, clean, no bigger than a biscuit. Not a gift, not a message, just a small act of presence. And somehow it meant more than words. 2 days later, Virgil came back with another box, this one with things that wouldn't be missed. A small pot with a dented lid, a blanket with a burn mark near the hem, and an old comb. Whole, unbroken. He didn't go into the stall this time either, just placed it outside and left like before. But that night, when the wind kicked up something fierce, and he swore he heard a screen door bang 3 times down the valley, he saw a shape moving from the shed toward his porch. Clara, carrying something wrapped in cloth. She didn't say anything when he opened the door, just held it out. It was a carved horse, small, roughly done, its legs too thick, its ears lopsided, but someone had taken time. Smoothed the wood, given it eyes made of charcoal dots. Virgil took it like it was made of glass. Clara stepped back, nodded once, and disappeared into the dark. He stood there a long time, longer than the wind, then set the horse on the mantel beside the old saint's figure that once belonged to his wife. Something was settling in the corners of his house now, not noise, not chaos, but the idea of return, that things lost might not come back whole, but they could come back changed, reclaimed, repurposed. One afternoon he caught Annie watching him from the edge of the field. Her arms were folded across her chest, not tight, just steady. He was hauling fence posts. Same work he'd done for decades. Same rhythm in his shoulder, in his breath. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one watching the wind come down from the hills. Their eyes met, and she nodded. Not thanks, not permission, just the kind of nod folks give each other when the burden is shared, even if no one says it. And when he returned that evening, the boots were gone. The white stone was still there, but beside it now sat something new. A sprig of dry sage, tied in string. The wind on dry mesa never asked where you came from, only whether you'd last the winter. It whipped over hills, rattled loose window shutters, and scoured the soul clean if you let it. Virgil Wade had come to understand that wind, not fear it, not fight it, just respect it, like grief or time. On a Wednesday when the sky was the color of hammered tin, Virgil heard a knock at his door. Not a loud one, just 3 quick taps, the kind that says, "I'll leave if you don't answer." He opened it slowly, expecting the postman or maybe no one at all. It was Annie, and behind her stood Jonas, the small boy with eyes too big for his face and silence too thick for his age. "He don't talk," Annie said, hands clasped in front of her apron, fingers pulling at each other like she hadn't decided whether to hold on or let go. "But he knows how to help." Virgil looked down at the boy, thin, solemn, a hand-me-down shirt, half-buttoned, sleeves too long. He didn't blink, just waited. "He good with his hands?" Virgil asked. Annie nodded once. "Watches careful," that was enough. Virgil didn't say much as he stepped off the porch. He just motioned toward the woodpile with a tilt of his chin and handed Jonas a small hatchet. Dull, but safe, for a boy. The boy took it with both hands, not like it was a toy or a burden, but like it was a kind of welcome. They walked in silence, the kind that doesn't press, only settles. Virgil didn't teach with words, he showed, laid the first log down on the stump, placed his own axe carefully, split it in one clean stroke. Then he nodded to Jonas. The boy watched, lips pressed tight. He set his log. Raised the hatchet awkwardly, missed the first time. But he reset. Tried again. This time the wood cracked. Not perfect, but honest. Virgil didn't smile, didn't praise, just reached for the next log. And together, they worked. Annie watched from a distance, not close enough to interfere, not far enough to retreat. Her hands twisted at her waist, not out of fear, but memory. You could tell she'd seen boys handed tools before. Maybe to work, maybe to earn, maybe to survive. But not like this. Not as a gesture of trust, of presence. That evening, Virgil found the boy still stacking kindling near the back wall, making his own small order of things. He didn't speak, not once, but when Virgil grunted and jerked a thumb toward the porch, the boy followed like he'd understood every word. Inside, Virgil poured a cup of warm milk, didn't ask if he wanted it, just set it on the table, same as he would for any man who'd helped him split wood. Jonas sat, feet not reaching the floor, hands wrapped around the tin cup. Still no words. But his breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped a little. And Virgil didn't mind the silence. When Annie came to fetch him, she didn't knock. Didn't need to. Virgil opened the door and found her standing there, arms folded tight against the wind, hair tucked under a shawl that had seen too many winters. "He all right?" she asked. Virgil nodded. "He's got a good swing," he said, almost like he meant it casual. But his voice caught, just slightly. Annie's eyes softened, just a flicker. "Sometimes I think they'll never learn how to be kids again," she said, voice thin. "Been too long since anyone looked at them like they were more than trouble." "They ain't trouble," Virgil said. He said it plainly, like it was fact, and Annie She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, then said, "Thank you." Not like a habit, not like she'd said it 1,000 times, but like it had cost her something, something precious. That night, after they were gone, Virgil sat by the stove with both cups of coffee on the table. The second one no longer felt ceremonial. It felt expected, like it belonged again. He reached over and adjusted the carved wooden horse on the mantel, then reached for his wife's old sewing tin, pulled out a scrap of leather and a rusted tack. He began to braid something. Didn't know what yet, just let his fingers work. Later he hammered a single nail near the kitchen door. Small, low to the floor, a coat peg, not for him. Too low, too small. He looked at it a long while before turning out the lamp. The next morning Jonas showed up at the door without being asked. He didn't knock, just sat on the step, waiting. When Virgil opened the door, he handed the boy a biscuit, without a word, then picked up his own coat and motioned toward the barn. The two walked side by side into the cold, and if a neighbor had seen them, they might have thought it was a rancher training a hand. But it wasn't that. It was something slower, something smaller, a man who'd lost too much finding space for someone who'd never had enough. Not pity, just presence. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. That afternoon Annie stopped by with a loaf of bread, roughly shaped, crust blackened from an uneven stove, but warm. She didn't ask to come in, just held it out. Virgil took it, nodded, then held the door open a second longer. She looked past him into the house, at the peg, at the fire, at the cup on the table. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She just whispered, "He used to dream of having a peg for his own things." Virgil looked at the nail, then back at her. Now he's got one. Mia Virgil Wade had lived long enough to know names didn't mean much when you didn't have someone to say them out loud. His own name, he hadn't heard it spoken soft in years, not since Callie passed. Town folks used it like an address. "Hey, Wade," or "Virgil, your wagon's in the way." Never Virgil, the way Callie used to say it at dawn, half a whisper, like she was afraid to wake the morning before it was ready. But this winter something strange started to happen. He found himself speaking again. Not full sentences, just small things, soft like testing whether the air would hold them, like hatchets on the post, or "don't waste bark, burns too fast." And he didn't know if he meant those words for Jonas or for himself. Either way, they didn't vanish in the cold the way they used to. That Sunday, Virgil made 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it. He'd done that before, out of habit, out of grief, maybe just out of plain stubbornness. But this time, he set one on the table across from him, then left it there. Not for the ghost of Callie, not anymore. It wasn't that her absence hurt less. It's just that the room no longer felt empty. Clara came by just after noon. She didn't knock, just stepped into the porch's edge of shadow and held something out. It was carved from driftwood, rough, almost shapeless, but Virgil could tell what it was meant to be. A horse, the legs too thick, the head too square, but someone had taken time with it, sanded the bottom smooth, scratched a saddle with the tip of a nail. "Jonas made it," Clara said, "with a butter knife. Took him a week." She didn't smile, not exactly, just held it steady, the way kids do when they think maybe their offering isn't enough. Virgil took it like it was gold. "Tell him it rides straight," he said, voice low. Then he turned and placed it carefully on the mantel, right beside the old ceramic saint that had belonged to Callie's mother. Hadn't touched that thing in years. Now the two of them stood there together, horse and saint, grief and grace, old and new. Clara watched, then nodded once and walked off. That night, after the fire settled to coals, Virgil stayed in his chair a long while. The wind outside whispered dry leaves across the porch. Inside, the carved horse caught firelight in its crooked saddle. He didn't light a lamp. didn't need to. Because across the stillness of night, carried through the snow-heavy hush, came a sound he hadn't heard in over a decade, singing, faint, unsteady, but real. Annie's voice, muffled through stall walls and distance, but clear enough to know it was hers. She was singing to the baby, a lullaby with no real tune anymore, just fragments, the way memory clings to pieces long after the rest has faded. Virgil closed his eyes. Callie used to hum that same rhythm, same pace. Not the melody, no, that belonged to Annie now, but the feeling, that feeling of someone trying to keep the dark away for just one more night. The next morning, snow dusted the corral fence and clung to the windows in patterns like fern leaves. Jonas showed up early, dragging a feed sack full of kindling. Didn't say a word, just nodded and got to work. Clara came behind him with a pair of cracked leather gloves. Virgil opened the barn door before they even reached the steps. Inside, a breakfast plate waited on the table with 3 biscuits and a slice of apple that had gone soft. He didn't say, "It's for you." Didn't have to. Clara sat. Jonas climbed onto the bench. They didn't thank him, didn't need to, because what they shared now wasn't charity. It was presence, mutual, silent, and stitched with small actions. Annie appeared not long after, shawl over one shoulder, carrying a threadbare scarf she twisted like she wasn't sure if she should have come. She didn't speak right away, just looked around the room, at the second cup still steaming, at the plate now empty but not cleared, at the wooden horse keeping quiet company on the mantel. And then her eyes landed on the nail by the door, her scarf uncurled in her fingers. She hung it there right beside Jonas's coat, didn't say a word, didn't have to. That peg had waited all its life for something that wasn't just a coat. Later that day, while Jonas helped bring water from the well, Virgil pulled a small pouch from the drawer, one that had once held Callie's sewing pins, and handed it to Annie. It held thread, 2 buttons, and a brass thimble. "I reckon you sew better than me," he muttered. Annie held the pouch carefully like it might bite, then looked up and said, "I ain't much good at finishing things. Always moved before I got the chance." Virgil didn't answer right away, just leaned against the doorway and watched Jonas line up stones outside the stall, neat little rows like fence posts. "Well," Virgil said, "maybe you'll finish something here." That evening, Clara knocked gently before stepping in. She reached for the second cup and held it in her hands before sitting. Didn't drink it, just sat with it, like it was a promise of something. Virgil didn't stop her. Annie came in shortly after, baby on her hip, quiet but alert. Jonas curled under the table, tracing charcoal lines on the floorboard, 6 stick figures holding hands. When Virgil looked down at them, he didn't say a thing, but his throat tightened, because in all 6, someone had drawn a wide-brimmed hat on the tallest one. The house didn't feel full yet, but it no longer echoed. The stove crackled. The coats hung 2 by 2. The silence, once sharp and cutting, had softened, like dust settling after a long ride, like a name spoken once more, even if no one heard it. Mia. The wind shifted by midweek, less cruel but mean in another way. It carried voices now, not songs, not prayer, just gossip, sharp as fence wire, blowing in from town. Virgil Wade had been around long enough to know the sound of brewing trouble. It didn't start with shouting. It started with a certain hush, the kind that stretched too long after a name was said, or a whisper that waited until boots were out of earshot. This time it began behind the butcher's block, and it came in the form of a boy with too much pride and not enough raising. Ned Granger was 19, red-faced and broad-shouldered, but his hands still shook when he lifted a cleaver. His pa, the butcher, was thinning with drink and bile, and half the town whispered that the meat smelled off, since the boy started trimming fat on his own. So Ned made up for his uncertainty by swinging louder, laughing harder. That afternoon he tossed a heap of blood-streaked scraps into the alley like he was feeding wolves. Clara had come into town to fetch flour, borrowed a coin Virgil had slipped into her coat pocket the day before. Ned saw her, saw the patched skirt, the quiet shoulders, the way she paused when she thought no one was looking. He grinned, wide and ugly. "They grateful yet, those dirty ones?" he called out, his voice just loud enough for 3 other men to hear. "Or are they still living off Mr. Wade's pity jerky?" Clara didn't answer. She lowered her head, clutching the flour bag so tight her knuckles turned white. But Annie heard it from across the street. She was standing in front of the mercantile with baby Daisy tied close to her chest. She walked over slow, not in anger, but in that brittle, tired way a woman walks when she's been through too much to play coy. When she reached Ned, she stopped just outside the reach of his shadow. "We didn't ask kindness," Annie said. Her voice was clear, not raised. "We offered work." Ned scoffed, tossing another hunk of gristle onto the ice-packed alley. "You offered shame, is what? Slunk back here with brats and no name. My ma says girls like you don't deserve—" Annie didn't flinch, didn't shout. But Clara stepped in between them then, without thinking, without a word. Just a girl with cracked shoes and shoulders that hadn't quite grown into a woman's shape yet. And for the first time, Ned hesitated. Just a moment. But it was enough to break his rhythm. Later that night, the saloon buzzed low. The tale had already warped. Some said Annie cursed the boy. Others said Virgil put Ned on his back with a closed fist. Neither was true, but Virgil heard all of it. And he didn't answer, didn't defend, didn't deny. He just walked into the shed at dawn, handed Annie a small leather pouch, and placed a folded seed catalog on the stall bench. "Buy seed," he said. "Plant something." Annie didn't reach for it right away. Her hand hung in the air, suspended like a bird deciding whether to land. "They'll think I stole it," she said. Virgil met her eyes. "Then I'll walk beside you." She held the pouch to her chest, the way folks hold on to old photographs, tender, unsure if it would last. "You don't have to," she murmured. "It's not your—" "I know," he said, cutting her off soft. "Don't have to be mine to matter." It was the closest thing to a declaration she'd heard in years, and it wasn't loud, just steady. By noon, Annie stood at the mercantile's counter with Clara beside her. The seeds were wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Behind her, Jonas sat on the stoop, drawing lines in the dust with a broken stick. No one dared say a word that day, not even Ned. That evening, the earth behind the shed was marked with the first trowel cuts. Clara worked in silence. Jonas ran circles, chasing chickens that didn't belong to them. Virgil stood by the fence post, watching the way Annie knelt and pushed seed into soil like it was a kind of prayer. The pouch was empty now, but her hands were full of something weightless, something that hadn't been hers in a long time. Dignity. Inside, the extra cup of coffee sat untouched, still warm, still waiting. On the mantel, the carved horse leaned against the saint like they belonged together, and above the door, the scarf Annie had hung no longer drooped like surrender. It moved gently in the draft, like a flag of something that hadn't been claimed yet, but was getting close. Maya, some mornings didn't need a rooster or a knock. They started with the hush of snow melting off the barn roof, the creak of old boots on frost-bitten planks, and the steady rhythm of a child's small hands stacking kindling. That morning, Jonas was already halfway through his chore when Virgil stepped outside with the empty coffee pot. The boy hadn't spoken a word since the day Annie brought him forward and said, "He don't talk, but he knows how to help." And maybe he didn't need to. Some people were just born with a quieter way of making themselves known. Jonas wasn't tall enough to reach the top of the woodpile. So he'd figured out how to wedge a boot between the split rails, climb halfway, and balance himself as he lifted each log over to the porch. His rhythm wasn't perfect, but it was steady, intentional. Virgil didn't interrupt. He just watched from the steps, arms crossed, letting the moment breathe. Jonas's coat was a little too big. Clara had patched it from 2 others, but it swung around him like a cape, sleeves flapping as he worked. Then suddenly, just as Virgil turned to open the door, the boy dropped the last log with a soft thunk, crossed the few feet of icy ground, and hugged him from behind. No announcement, no noise, just 2 thin arms around an old rancher's waist, holding on like something small and scared had decided it wasn't scared anymore. Virgil stood still for a long second, then one hand, weathered, cracked at the knuckles, reached down and rested on the boy's back. That was all, but it was enough. From the kitchen window, Annie saw it. She didn't move, didn't rush to join, just leaned a little against the worn sill, eyes burning, not from smoke, but from something older than that. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since before Daisy was born. Something close to peace. Later that afternoon, Virgil fetched his old toolbox from the back shed. Jonas followed him inside, still quiet, but curious. Together they cleared a spot on the kitchen wall beside the stove. Virgil hammered a small peg into the timber, low enough for a child's coat, measured, firm, permanent. Jonas placed his mittens on it like it was a ceremony. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That evening, Annie stood at the doorway, drying her hands on her apron, watching the light shift across the floorboards. Clara was bent near the hearth, stitching a button onto her younger brother's shirt. The twins played with the carved wooden horse on the mantel, the one Clara had given to Virgil weeks ago. It now bore a small scratch on its flank, a mark from use, not neglect. Daisy, the baby, slept in a cradle made from an old apple crate, wrapped in blankets so worn they were nearly translucent. But she didn't cry, not anymore, because the room no longer echoed with uncertainty. It breathed warmth, and for the first time the walls of Virgil Wade's ranch house didn't just hold out the cold. They held in something else, something harder to name. Just after supper, Clara tiptoed to the door and hung a scrap of paper above the coat peg. It was cut crooked, written with coal smudge, and barely legible, but Virgil bent to read it anyway. For Jonas, 3 simple words. No sermon, no plea, no claim. Just placement, like putting a name on the corner of a quilt or carving initials into a beam. It meant, this is where you belong. As night settled, Annie lingered by the window again. Virgil passed behind her on the way to check the latch. "You didn't ask what I ran from," she said, not turning around. "No," Virgil said. "Didn't need to." She looked at him then, eyes rimmed with something softer than before. "You're not afraid of the way folks talk, are you? Wasn't afraid of the war. Ain't afraid of wagging tongues." She smiled, just a little, just enough to crinkle one side of her mouth. "That's good," she said, "'cause I think we're staying." That night, the fire didn't flicker down to embers. It held a steady flame, quiet and strong. On the mantel, the old saint's figure leaned a little, to the side, balanced now by the carved horse and a new addition, a folded paper drawing of 6 stick figures holding hands under a lopsided roof. Jonas had drawn it with a charcoal stub and left it there without a word. There was no signature, but everyone knew who it belonged to, and everyone knew it was true. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Sometimes healing didn't come with a doctor or a sermon. Sometimes it arrived in the space between silence and presence. In the way a child leaned into someone they'd never been taught to trust, in the creak of a wall accepting one more coat, in the quiet knowing of a man who'd lived long enough to understand that what isn't said still counts. Mia. The knock came just past midnight. Not hard, not panicked. Just 3 slow raps against the wood, like someone asking, not demanding. Virgil Wade was already half awake, boots still by the stove. He didn't light a lantern, didn't call out. Just stood, pulled on his coat, and opened the door. Annie stood there, soaked to the knees. Baby Daisy wrapped in her arms like a bundle of winter breath, barely holding shape. "She's burning," Annie said. "Her skin. She's too hot. She won't drink." The words shook as she said them, but not from cold, from fear. Virgil didn't answer. He didn't need to. He took one look at the child's limp hand peeking from the feed sack wrap and turned to saddle the mule. The road to Doc Merritt's place wasn't a road. Not this late in the season. It was a stretch of snow-covered arroyo, littered with branches from last week's windstorm. The stars were too dim to light anything useful, but Virgil knew the trail. He'd ridden it once when his own wife caught fever. Years ago now, but some routes don't get unlearned, especially the ones you ride desperate. Daisy didn't make a sound, not even a whimper. That silence cut deeper than a cry would have. Annie rode behind Virgil, wrapped in a coat too big for her. Clutching Daisy like the weight of her was the only thing keeping her steady. She didn't ask if they were going the right way. She didn't say thank you, but her hands, frozen, trembling, stayed clutched at Virgil's waist the entire ride. And when the wind turned cruel, he reached back once and tucked her shawl tighter without looking. Doc Merritt opened the door in a rumpled shirt and long johns. Didn't ask questions. Just took the baby from Annie's arms and laid her on the kitchen table. The stove was cold, but his hands were steady. "Fever's in the lungs," he muttered, set in hard. He didn't offer comfort, just reached for a kettle and lit the fire. Annie stood by the wall like a shadow stitched in place. Virgil pulled a chair behind her, but she didn't sit. Just watched the doctor move, watching for hope in the space between his movements. At one point she whispered, "Will she?" Doc didn't answer, just kept working. Steam rose from the kettle. A tin spoon clinked against the glass. Minutes passed like hours. Outside, snow thickened. Inside, a small life held on. When Daisy finally whimpered, barely like the cry of a wet leaf tearing, Annie broke. She sagged against the wall, arms folded across her chest as if they didn't believe what they'd just heard. "She's not done yet," the doctor said gently. "But keep her warm, real warm. You get her home, build a fire, and don't let it go out. She'll need holding more than medicine." Annie nodded, but her eyes were somewhere else, somewhere years behind her, in another winter with another child she hadn't been able to save. Virgil watched her shoulders shake once. No sound came out. The ride back was slower, not for fear, just exhaustion. Annie held Daisy close, the baby's breath finally audible against her neck. Her eyes never left the child's face. Her lips moved sometimes, whispering something, prayers maybe, or names long lost. When the house came into view, Virgil didn't stop to announce. He just swung down, took Daisy from Annie's arms, and carried her to the hearth without a word. Jonas and Clara were already stoking the fire, twin boys curled under quilts nearby, eyes wide but quiet. Virgil placed Daisy in the makeshift cradle, now lined with warmed stones and flannel. Annie knelt beside it, hands shaking as she touched the child's cheek. Then something happened that hadn't happened since she came to Dry Mesa. She reached up and placed her hand on Virgil's, not for balance, not for show, just to hold it. His hand didn't move, but neither did hers. "I never expected anyone to come back," she said softly. "Not really. I've always run, always had to." Virgil didn't reply. He looked down at Daisy, then back to the woman beside him. But You did, she whispered. You came back. Still he said nothing, but his other hand drifted slowly and rested gently atop hers. And that, for Annie, said more than 1,000 promises ever could. Later, when the house quieted again and snow softened its roar, Virgil sat back in his rocker by the fire. The second coffee cup was still on the mantel, unused. But something had changed. For once, the room didn't feel like it belonged to ghosts. It felt like it belonged to people trying, quietly, tenderly, to stay. Mia, the sheriff, didn't come loud. He came like the cold, firm, uninvited, and unwilling to be ignored. Late morning, after the snow had turned to slush and the smell of boiled oats drifted faint from Virgil Wade's stove, a saddle creaked outside. Then bootsteps, steady as a law book closing. Sheriff Linver knocked once, then opened the door before anyone answered. He was that kind of man, always had been. The kind who didn't mind getting his boots muddy in someone else's threshold, if it meant checking whose fire still burned. Virgil looked up from the table, spoon halfway to his mouth. Clara was beside him, feeding Jonas slowly, oatmeal cooling in the spoon. Annie stood by the window, drying Daisy's clothes on a line, stretched near the heat. The sheriff didn't take his hat off. "Morning," he said. "Mind if I come in?" "You already did," Virgil said. Linver's mouth pulled into something close to a grin, but not quite. He stepped in, looked around, saw the second tin cup, the children's boots lying neat by the door, the coat peg newly nailed low on the wall for little hands to reach. "What's this, then?" he said, voice polite in the way thorns are sharp without yelling. "Breakfast," Virgil said. Linver didn't smile. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. "Got word from Judge Hathaway," he said. "Folks talk in town. Word says you got 6 living here. 1 grown, 5 minors. No papers, no records, no husband attached, no property rights claimed." He tapped the paper gently on the table. "Technically, they're vagrants." Clara looked down. Jonas gripped his spoon tighter, oatmeal falling to the floor. Virgil didn't blink. Annie moved, not frantic, not soft. She just stepped away from the window, hands drying on her apron, face calm but eyes made of something tougher than glass. "I've run before," she said evenly, "from men like you, from cold like this, from shame and fists and everything else that wouldn't give me a name." She looked at Jonas, then Clara, then the twins curled together on the cot. "But I'm not running now, not this time. These are my children. We don't owe this land anything, but they've planted beans in it, carried water to it, breathed warmth into wood that didn't deserve it." She looked the sheriff in the eye. "They have roots here. Silence, the kind that doesn't echo, the kind that waits to see if a heart will flinch." Virgil stood slowly. "They don't carry my name," he said. Sheriff turned to him, brows slightly raised. Virgil continued, voice rough but still. "But they made this place mine again." He stepped between Annie and the sheriff, not blocking, just standing. A wall not made of brick, but something stronger. "I didn't ask for them," he said. "Didn't go looking, but they showed up, cold, hungry, asking the smallest thing." He nodded toward the table. "And now, well, this house don't creak like it used to. Stove don't burn out before morning, and I ain't drank coffee alone in weeks." Sheriff Linver looked at him for a long time, then folded the paper, stuffed it back inside his coat. "Judge don't like trouble," he said finally. "He likes quiet towns with empty jails. You keep it quiet here?" Virgil nodded once. "I reckon we will." Linver looked at Clara, then Jonas, then Annie, whose hands had stopped shaking. He turned toward the door. "I didn't write a word," he said, and left. That night, Virgil didn't say anything, didn't need to, but he sharpened the hatchet extra smooth, sanded the rocking chair edge where Jonas liked to lean, and checked the stovepipe twice for leaks. Annie sat in the kitchen sewing buttons onto the twins' coats. When Clara brushed past him carrying a kettle, she looked up and said, "I thought we'd have to leave." Virgil didn't look up from his knife. "Only way you leave now," he said, "is if you want to." Jonas sat in the corner carving something into a scrap of wood. No one asked what, and for the first time, the house didn't just feel full. It felt claimed. Mia, the stall behind the house, stood empty now. Its walls, once thin and drafty, had been taken apart plank by Virgil and little Jonas over the last 3 weeks. What could be salvaged was hauled to the south end of the yard, where Virgil had laid fresh beams into a square foundation. Nothing grand, just straight enough to call a start. And this morning, with spring hinting at the edges of the snowmelt, Jonas dragged a hammer half his size across the frosty grass, his tiny boots crunching like kindling. Virgil didn't stop him, just watched. From the porch, Annie knelt with a pot of seed potatoes beside her, green bean shoots trembling in her cupped hand. She pressed the soil gently, more like tucking a child under a blanket than planting for yield. A rhythm to it, a knowing. Behind her, Clara helped the twins lift rocks from the edge of the yard, stacking them neatly. Not told to do so, just done because something inside them said, "We'll stay. Let's shape this place." In dry Mesa, folks didn't say much to your face, but a cracked window could whisper louder than any preacher, and the town had started whispering plenty. "Virgil Wade's lost his mind," muttered the woman who ran the dry goods store, rearranging her jars so the peach preserves didn't face the window that looked down toward Virgil's spread. 3 more mouths show up in winter, and somehow he finds flour, added the banker, polishing his spectacles. "You ask me, he's being taken advantage of." "They're not even his," spat Ned, the butcher's son, kicking at a post as if it had insulted him. "He's building him a house with town-bought lumber, and not a single Sunday has she brought those brats to service." The preacher, overhearing, only said, "Neither did the Good Samaritan, and I don't recall Christ asking for papers." Still the words traveled, through door hinges and church steps, through milk runs and poker tables, but they never reached the ranch. Not really, because while town had ears, the ranch had hands. Jonas carried nails in his palm like he'd grown up building barns. Virgil didn't speak much during the build, only pointed, nodded, grunted approval when Jonas placed a beam steady or held a rail straight. The boy didn't need praise, he needed presence, and Virgil gave it. At lunch, Clara brought out warm corn mush wrapped in cloth and set it on a flat stone where they sat. She didn't look for thanks. She didn't wait to be noticed. She just handed it over and sat beside Jonas, bumping her shoulder into his like a brother. From the porch, Annie watched all this, hands resting on her lap, apron still damp from watering the green shoots by the fence. She didn't speak either, didn't ask for gratitude, didn't voice what she saw, but her eyes softened in a way that said, "They've never had this, and now they do." Later that afternoon, when the new roof had its last plank nailed and the sun slid low enough to throw copper light across the raw wood, Clara stepped inside and nailed something above the frame of the rough door. It was a thin board, no bigger than a folded napkin, but she'd burned letters into it with the tip of a fire-stirring rod. Just 3 words. "We're still here, not painted, not grand. No name on it, no date. Just here." A word heavy as home. Virgil walked by it that evening, running his thumb across the edge of the grain. He didn't say anything, but when he passed the fireplace later, he picked up a box of roofing nails and left it near the new wall. Quiet approval. The next morning, the preacher came by. Didn't bring a sermon, didn't bring judgment, just a pot of lard, a side of salt pork, and a fresh shirt for Jonas that someone had mistakenly ordered too small. He didn't stay long, just placed the things on the porch and tipped his hat. Annie stood in the doorway, the twins peeking from behind her legs. "Thank you," she said, voice even. The preacher gave a quiet nod. "We don't all listen to gossip," he said. "Some of us listen to what grows." That night, Clara helped build a small shelf beside the fireplace. No one asked what it was for, but she placed the carved horse back on it, and next to it, a folded drawing, Jonas's handiwork, depicting the house with 6 stick figures beneath it. Virgil looked at it before bed. He added a piece of dried sage from his wife's old box beside the horse. Didn't speak, but as he turned off the lantern, he let the silence settle over the room, like a quilt. Thick, warming, claimed. The town kept talking. That didn't change. But by then, it didn't matter, because inside that home of stitched walls and hand-grown roots, a different kind of story was being written, one not told in names or claims, but in hands that built, in seeds that trusted soil, and in one small board above a door, whispering to the world, "We're still here." Mia. The snow that morning fell so soft it seemed to ask permission. It didn't gather in gusts or howl at the porch posts, just drifted down like flour from heaven, blanketing the yard with hush. It dusted the rake Annie had left near the potatoes, covered the broken nail Jonas had dropped beside the woodpile, softened the hard edges of things. Inside, the stove whispered in the quiet, its belly warm and pulsing. Virgil poured 2 cups of coffee like he always did, one for himself, one for the ghost he no longer named. Just a habit. Maybe a ritual. The second cup always went untouched, until that morning. He heard the knock before it came, a kind of presence in the floorboards. Light but sure, not asking, becoming. When the door eased open, it wasn't Annie. It was Clara. She stepped in like she'd always been. Allowed to, though she never had. Didn't look at him, didn't fidget, just walked to the table, eyes on the cup. Then, quiet as dust, she picked it up, not to drink, just to hold, cradled it in both hands, and sat down across from him, steam curling between her fingers. Virgil didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her small frame settle into the chair, as if it had always had her shape in mind. The second cup never stayed warm long, but now it did. She glanced up once, eyes tired but clear, not looking for permission, just being seen. That was enough. When Annie came in a few minutes later, she paused in the doorway, took in the sight, Clara at the table, cup in hand, no word said. Then, almost as if it were part of a rhythm she'd always known, she stepped forward and wiped her hands on the hem of her apron, nodding to Virgil like she did when water boiled or bread was done rising. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't apology, it was acknowledgement. This is how it is now. Outside, Jonas sat beneath the kitchen window. He liked the way the stove heat pressed against the wall. On a piece of smooth floorboard Clara had given him, he drew with a stub of charcoal, careful not to smudge, 6 figures, holding hands, no faces, just the shape of closeness. He drew a roof over them, the lines crooked but thick. Then, at the very top, a curl of smoke, one trail from one chimney. Jonas wiped his sleeve across his nose and smiled, without realizing. Later that day, Virgil walked out to the lean-to near the barn, where the clutter of ears still leaned into itself. He found a tin can of screws, a broken drawer, and the old rocking chair that had belonged to his wife, its joints dry and one leg uneven. He brought it back to the house, didn't say why, didn't ask. He sanded the edges, rubbed oil into the wood, wedged a bit of cloth under the short leg. Then he set it by the fire and walked away. By sundown, Clara had curled into it, one of the twins asleep across her lap. Jonas handed her a thick quilt. No one said a word. That evening, Annie stood at the stove, spoon in one hand, the other resting on the small of her back. She stirred slow. Not because the stew needed it, but because her hands needed something to do. Virgil walked in from the barn, boots muddy with thaw. He watched her for a while before speaking. "Had that pot since my wife's time," he said finally. "She never let it go dry." Annie didn't answer, just lifted the spoon to taste, then nodded once and added a bit more salt. She didn't ask if she was allowed to use it. She didn't have to. After dinner, they sat quietly. The twins fell asleep in a pile on the rug. Jonas leaned against Virgil's leg, thumbing a wooden block he'd carved earlier. Clara rocked slow in the chair, eyes half closed. The wind tapped once on the window glass, then went quiet, like even it knew not to disturb the moment. Annie sat at the table, hands folded in her lap. Then, almost too soft to notice, she said, "You left that second cup out every day." Virgil didn't look up. "Habit," he murmured. Annie smiled, not the kind that showed teeth, but the kind that softened a woman's whole face. "It's not empty anymore." He didn't answer, but he looked at her, held the look longer than usual. And maybe that was his answer. They didn't sign papers, didn't change names, didn't move furniture or make announcements in town. But the next morning, when Clara poured the second cup herself and handed it to Annie, Virgil said nothing, just drank his slow, then went out to fix the fence. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't look over his shoulder to see if they'd stay. He didn't have to, because home didn't arrive with fanfare or flags. Sometimes it came in the form of a girl picking up a coffee cup, or a boy sketching crooked figures under one roof, or a woman finally letting her shoulders fall. Mia. The snow came again, but this time nobody braced against it. There were no shivers at the window, no wind howling like a reminder of what was lost. It came soft as it did before, but now it wasn't an ending. It was just weather, just the world breathing in white. Inside the small house, with the uneven porch and the stove that never stopped burning, life kept going, slow, human, full of little things that mattered. Jonas sat beneath the window tracing letters in a pan of flour. He'd drawn 6 stick figures in charcoal the week before. Today he tried to spell something. One word, S-T-A-Y. He whispered each letter under his breath, over and over, as if repetition could make it real. At the table, Clara helped one of the twins sound out shapes. She had taken to teaching like it was a job someone had left for her, and she wasn't about to leave it undone. Virgil stood by the window, a mug warm in his hands. Same old tin thing, bent near the lip where it had once been dropped during calving season. He never replaced it, just learned how to drink from the good side. His eyes tracked the snow falling on the yard. Same yard where the stall used to be. Same place Annie now planted pole beans. He could just make out the edge of the furrows beneath the dusting of white. They weren't gone, just waiting. Annie moved beside him, quiet as habit. She stood close, not touching, but near. Her apron smelled faintly of biscuits and wood smoke. Her hair was damp from the wash basin, pinned up the way she used to before everything went wrong. She watched the yard with him, watched the small figures move, Jonas drawing, Clara helping, the others sprawled and quiet, the way children get when the air feels heavy and clean. She said, "You never asked if we'd leave." Virgil kept looking out the window. "I didn't have to." Then he turned, just slightly. "I saw enough to hope you'd stay. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't some grand speech. But to Annie, it might as well have been scripture, because it wasn't just that they could stay, it was that someone hoped they would. And that changed everything. She didn't answer, didn't need to, just rested her hand on the worn wood sill beside his, close enough that their fingers nearly touched, but didn't. That was enough. Later that day, the wind picked up, but not rough, just enough to lift the curtains a little, enough to stir the smell of stew from the kitchen out into the hallway, where the twins were curled up with a dog-eared book Jonas had rescued from the ash pile. Virgil walked past them and lit the lamp early. Something about the way the snow fell made him want to beat the dark to the punch. He didn't speak, just trimmed the wick and carried it to the mantel, setting it beside the small wooden horse Clara had carved. Next to it, still there, was the old saint's figure that had belonged to his wife. He didn't move it, didn't hide it. Just let it share the space. That night, Annie sang, "Software Something Old," not in English, not in fear, the kind of song passed from mothers who remembered who they were even when the world forgot. She sat on the edge of the bed, the baby, Daisy, suckling in sleep. Virgil heard it from the hallway. He paused there, one hand on the doorframe. Didn't say a word, just stood, like a man watching the last ember of something painful finally cool down, leaving space for something else, not joy, not yet, but peace. And that was enough. When morning came, 2 mugs sat on the table again. This time, one held dark coffee, steaming, the other warm milk, and beside them, 6 small bowls with 6 matching spoons. Clara had set the table, Jonas had lit the fire, and someone had swept the floor. The porch was quieter than usual, but not empty. Virgil stepped out into the chill. No coat, just a thick vest. He leaned on the post where the sign used to be, back when his name had meant alone. He didn't need a sign now. Inside, there were voices, footsteps, laughter that didn't need to ask permission. He looked down and saw the boot prints trailing from the house into the barn. Small ones. One set dragging slightly where a boot was too big. They were there. And so was he. And that second cup? It was never empty again. Not because someone drank from it, but because someone had filled it. Someone stayed. In the end, it wasn't the snow that changed Virgil Wade. It wasn't even the knock at the saloon or the children behind the butcher's. It was what came after, the quiet presence of people who didn't owe him a thing, but chose to sit at his table anyway. And sometimes that's all a man needs to come back to life. Not a miracle, not a rescue, just a reason. And maybe, on a good morning, 2 cups, warm side by side. Out in dry Mesa, the snow didn't stop falling, but not all cold stays. Sometimes it takes just one man staying, one act that doesn't make headlines, just homes. And when a girl no longer flinches at footsteps, when a boy draws people holding hands instead of guns, that's the kind of rescue the West doesn't write about much. But it should. If this story stirred something quiet in you, a memory, a hope, or just the feel of a fire kept for someone else, then leave a word below. And if you believe the old trails still hold warmth, subscribe so the stories keep writing. We don't need loud heroes out here, just folks who stay.